You know, I keep hearing about this new series, Jeffrey Dahmer. And, growing up in that era, this really piqued my curiosity. And so, I had to check it out for myself. I got to tell you, I immediately saw the chatter is focused in all the wrong things. It might sound twisted, so bear with me. I'm seeing Dahmer as representative of us, any of us. Like, like you know, Like he's an exaggerated version of the effects of neoliberalism on the individual. We could look at other examples for sure, but have you ever seen the Joker? You know, Joaquin Phoenix, basically any of the mass shooters in recent history. I think the mainstream always wants to explain extreme antisocial behavior by pointing to the normal suspects, his parents, early trauma, mental illness. As a socialist, I have to look through a lens, a different lens, a scientific analysis lens. Jeffrey Dahmer exists in a particular time in history, with a particular social and economic condition. If a person can't adjust to an abnormal, distorted society, is that person the crazy one? Marx wrote about alienation as an intrinsic part of capitalism. Workers are basically cogs in a machine with no ties to what they're producing. Remember, Marx was writing in the 19th century. Much has changed since then, but alienation remains. In fact, it's still dominant and getting worse. Neoliberal capitalism relies on a citizenry that's alienated, isolated, feeling powerless. We have no connection to our communities whatsoever, much less our government. The point is, you can't understand a person or a family or a community apart from the economic system. You can't separate them from their historical era. Dahmer's family didn't appear to be financially insecure, but imagine if they had been ready, if they had ready access to counseling and to other medical services or a peer group or friends that were able to talk openly about the situations that were coming. Or if it wasn't taboo to talk about homosexuality, or if it wasn't taboo to talk about alcohol and drugs, or if it wasn't taboo to discuss the alienation we all feel from the capitalist society that we're in. Early in the series, one of the key factors was that Dahmer's father had to always work, was constantly leaving, and his mother was a drug addict. She was popping pills like crazy, but this was in a time where they handed out barbiturates like it was candy. Ultimately, you have a very, very hardcore situation where, unfortunately, instead of having something that is healthy and nurturing and capable of propping up the least capable of handling life on life's terms, instead, dad has to rush off to work. Mom is deep in misery, postpartum depression. No one understood how to treat it. No one understood what to do. Jeffrey Dahmer, a small, little, shy child, ends up being neglected and ignored and largely left alone. Now, his father did take interest in him and did do events with him and did care about him and, by all accounts, loved him. But the family dynamic was truly awful in so many ways, mainly because poor Jeffrey at that time he was a child. At that time, he had no one to talk to, no one that could understand, and everyone trying desperately to shoehorn him in to normal society. But Jeffrey wasn't normal. He had other things on his mind. He was coping with masking. He was masking all the things that were going on in his mind as a young child, the feelings of inadequacy, the feelings of not being good enough, the feelings of otherness, knowing that he was not normal. He knew intrinsically, inherently knew that he was not normal at an early age. But who is he to talk to as a small, innocent child? Now, I'm not talking about Jeffrey Dahmer, the man who devoured people and ate people and literally seduced them and lured them back to his apartment where he took and did gruesome, horrible things. Now, that's what everyone else is focusing on because that's the low-hanging fruit, but that's the distraction. That's the excitement. That is the thing that makes you go, ooh. But because of the society that we are in, because of this bootstrap individualist mindset that we are stuck in, I suspect people like Jeffrey Dahmer are a lot more plentiful than anyone would ever imagine. The question is, what pushes them from fantasy and rage and sorrow and deep depression to becoming an active serial killer? Well, I guess that's the question most people want to know about. But there's enough stories out there about that. What I want to talk to you all about is alienation. Let's go.
Let's get ready to grumble!
You know, in 2016, George Monbiot in The Guardian wrote a great piece called Neoliberalism is Creating Loneliness. That's what's wrenching society apart. He says epidemics of mental illness are crushing the minds and bodies of millions. It's time to ask where we are heading and why. So let me just go ahead and explain this. Ultimately, Jeffrey Dahmer was extremely alone. He was extremely isolated. He was isolated in his mind. He was isolated across the board. Jeffrey Dahmer was ultimately someone that really, really needed help. He needed help at a very early age. He needed help coping with the thoughts that were in his head. He needed help linking to society, finding a way to get out of that space in his head. But more importantly, at the time when Jeffrey Dahmer was growing up, being a gay child, and he said in later interviews, he knew that he was a homosexual and he had no one to talk to. His parents didn't want to acknowledge it because they were creatures of the time as well. The historical materialism that we experienced during that time period tells us all that we need to know. Ultimately, he was destroyed before he ever had a chance to get started in life. And we understand this inherently because neoliberalism has been around for a very long time. Obviously, the 60s and 70s really saw a takeoff of neoliberalism, but the hard work, the tough bootstrap mindedness, the work first, living to work, not working to live. You know what I mean? This whole thing was really, really sweeping us away, working for the man, not being, able to focus on what your priorities are and being able to be with your children. What a huge, huge responsibility. And yet our society doesn't really allow for or make time for it. In fact, our society talks out of one side of its mouth saying it is so important to spend as much time as you can with your children. Then it simultaneously tells us it's so important to go get checked out for health care. It talks about early detection and going and getting assessed and evaluated for various ailments and illnesses. You've got to have money and you've got to have time. And they give you these aspirational goals. Why? To keep you wanting, to keep an empty spot in your soul. That you're always yearning for something beyond what you have, something beyond, something normal, though, in this case. A child wanting to be with his family, a child wanting nourishment and nurture, a child wanting love and actual acceptance. But neoliberalism creates nothing but alienation. Capitalism creates alienation. And if you listen to what George Monbiot says, you'll understand it's bigger than what any of us thought it was. Because ultimately, when you hear this, you are going to realize how fucked we are. Let's start with the beginning. He says, what greater indictment of a system could there be than an epidemic of mental illness? Yet plagues of anxiety, stress, depression, social phobia, eating disorders, self-harm, and loneliness now strike people down all over the world. The latest catastrophic figures for children's mental health in England reflect a global crisis. There are plenty of secondary reasons for this distress, but it seems to me that the underlying cause is everywhere the same: human beings, the ultra social mammals whose brains are wired to respond to other people, are being peeled apart. Economic and technological change play a major role, but so does ideology. Through our well being is inextricably linked to the lives of others. Everywhere we are told that we will prosper through competitive self interest and extreme individualism. This is neoliberalism, friends. In Britain, men who have spent their entire lives in quadrangles, at school, at college, at the bar, in parliament, instruct us to stand on our own 2 feet. The education systems become more brutally competitive by the year. Employment is a fight to the near death, with a multitude of other desperate people chasing fewer and fewer jobs. The modern overseers of the poor ascribe individual blame to economic circumstance. Endless competitions on television feed impossible aspirations as real opportunities contract. Consumerism fills the social void, but far from curing the disease of isolation, it intensifies social comparison to the point at which, having consumed all else, we start to prey upon ourselves. Social media brings us together and drives us apart, allowing us precisely to quantify our social standing and to see other people have more friends and followers than we do. Likes, clicks, bitches, right? As Rhiannon Lucy Coslet brilliantly documented, girls and young women routinely alter the photos they post to make themselves look smoother and slimmer. Some phones, using beauty settings, do it for you without asking you. Now, you can become your own thinspiration. Welcome to the post-Hobbesian dystopia, a war of everyone against themselves. Is it any wonder, in these lonely inner worlds in which touching has been replaced by retouching, that young women are drowning in mental distress? A recent survey in England suggests that 1 in 4 women between 16 and 24 have harmed themselves, and 1 in 8 now suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Anxiety, depression, phobias, and obsessive compulsive disorder affect 26% of women this age group. This is what a public health crisis looks like. If social rupture is not treated as seriously as broken limbs, it is because we cannot see it. But neuroscientists, a series of fascinating papers, suggest that social pain and physical pain are processed by the same neural circuits. This might explain why in many languages it's hard to describe the impact of breaking social bonds without the words we use to denote physical pain and injury. And both humans and on social mammals, social contact reduces physical pain. This is why we hug our children when they hurt themselves. Physical affection is a powerful analgesic. Opioids relieve both physical agony and the distress of separation. Perhaps this explains the link between social isolation and drug addiction. Now, if we take a step back from the article momentarily, we know Jeffrey Dahmer was extremely isolated and lonely and did not have the kinds of affection shown to him as a young child. Now, his father did love him for sure, but it doesn't change the fact the neoliberal framework had already begun to do its magic as a very, very, very small young man. Anyway, back to the article. Experiments summarized in the Journal of Physiology and Behavior last month suggest that given a choice of physical pain or isolation, social mammals will choose the former. Capuchin monkeys starved of both food and contact for 22 hours will rejoin their companions before eating. Children who experience emotional neglect, according to some findings, suffer worse mental health consequences than children suffering both emotional neglect and physical abuse. Hideous as it is, violence involves attention and contact. Self-harm is often used as an attempt to alleviate distress, another indication that physical pain is not as bad as emotional pain. As the prison system knows only too well, one of the most effective forms of torture is solitary confinement. It's not hard to see what the evolutionary reasons for social pain might be. Survival among social animals is greatly enhanced when they are strongly bonded with the rest of the pack. It is the isolated and marginalized animals that are most likely to be picked off by predators or to starve. Just as physical pain protects us from the physical injury, emotional pain protects us from the social injury. It drives us to reconnect, but many people find this almost impossible, as was the case for mass murderer Jeffrey Dahmer, who in his loneliness became obsessed, and the compulsion drove him to kill, maim, rape, and brutally destroy 17 young men. But it's the 17 young men, those victims and their families, that we always hear about and we feel sorry for, and rightfully so. They deserve to be respected, loved, and treated with respect, to be brought back into a healthy state. But they were never in a healthy state because the society, as we have it today and as it was then, is repressive and oppressive and continues this alienation and isolation. And I think it's important to understand this, because while we're driven to reconnect with people, when they reject us, when we're different, when we're other, we start getting into some real tangled webs. Pain brings on hate, because there's a saying that hurt people hurt people. And young Jeffrey Dahmer was definitely hurting. But Jeffrey Dahmer, again, I must say, is not that different. He's different in terms of what the final things that he did to really just put an exclamation point on how failed society is, how failed our social institutions are, how failed capitalism is in terms of reprioritizing our minds towards work as opposed to health and family and balance and well-being. So back to the article. George Monbiot says it's unsurprising that social isolation is strongly associated with depression, suicide, anxiety, insomnia, fear, and the perception of threat. It's more surprising to discover the range of physical illnesses that it causes or exacerbates: dementia, high blood pressure, heart disease, strokes, lowered resistance to viruses. Even accidents are more common among chronically lonely people. Loneliness has a comparable impact on physical health to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Folks, loneliness is lethal, especially loneliness brought on when you're a child and you don't know any better. Okay? This is not an excuse for Jeffrey Dahmer. This is not a defense of the things he did, but merely a cautionary tale for the rest of us. Okay? It's a cautionary tale for the rest of us. It says, back to the article, it says, loneliness has a comparable impact on physical health to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It appears to raise the risk of early death by 26%. This is partly because it enhances production of the stress hormone cortisol, which suppresses the immune system. Studies in both animals and humans suggest a reason for comfort eating. Isolation reduces impulse control. Think about this. Jeffrey Dahmer suffered from absolute compulsion and impulse control. He had zero or very little. He had some. He was able to go for periods of time, but in the end, it always came back. like Dexter, his dark passenger, would come calling again. Okay. And it says studies in both animals and humans suggest a reason for comfort eating. Isolation reduces impulse control, leading to obesity. As those at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder are most likely to suffer from loneliness, might this provide one of the explanations for the strong link between low economic status and obesity? Anyone can see that something far more important than those of the issues we fret about have gone wrong. So, why are we engaging in this world eating, self consuming frenzy of environmental destruction and social dislocation? If all it produces is unbearable pain, should this question not burn the lips of everyone in public life? There are some wonderful charities doing what they can to fight this tide, some of which I'm going to be working with as part of my loneliness project. This is George Monbiot, by the way, and this is back in 2016. You can find this article on the web. We'll put it into the show description. But this does not require a policy response. Okay? It requires something much bigger, the reprisal of an entire worldview, of all the fantasies human beings entertain. The idea that we can go it alone is the most absurd and perhaps most dangerous. We stand together or we fall. Now, folks, neoliberalism is all about. It is all about isolation. It is all about bootstraps. It is Ayn Rand minded libertarianism. It is me, myself, and I. It is the epitome of greed, but no one of us asked for it. This is just the system we were born into. And so think about this. Jeffrey Dahmer goes through the process of a horrible divorce. His mom leaves him in the house by himself. His father left thinking that the mother would still be there. And for months upon months upon months, young Jeffrey Dahmer, still a junior in high school, is drunk, literally trying to make life work for him. And in the darkness of all the loneliness and the despair and the abandonment, his sick fantasies that had been going on for his whole life, in one fell swoop, he kills his first person while they're gone. In isolation, the house is filled with beer cans. In isolation, the house is filled with trash. In isolation, he goes out on the hunt to fulfill that hole that society gave him through loneliness. Obviously, his mental state is something that will be studied for a lifetime, for generations to come. But he is not the point of this. We are. We are all so isolated from ourselves. We're masking the dissonance between who we are inside and who we have to be outside to get along in this shitty world. We don't have to be devouring people. We don't have to be leveraging the police force to know that they're not going to take care of poor black and brown people, so we'll predate on them. They don't need to do that because that's what society already does. In its own way, that's what society already does. Now, there's more recent articles as well. In January of 2018, The Conversation published a book or an article called How Neoliberalism is Damaging Your Mental Health. Okay, by Ruth Kane. She's a senior lecturer of law at the University of Kent. George Monbiot wrote his piece in 2016. 2018, Ruth Kane writes this, and it's titled, How Neoliberalism is Damaging Your Mental Health. There is widespread perception that mental ill health is on the rise in the West, in tandem with a prolonged decline in collective well-being. The idea that there are social and economic causes behind this perceived decline is increasingly convincing amid what has been termed zombie economics and grinding austerity, which have followed the global financial crash. In particular, there is growing concern that the conditions and the effects of neoliberalism, the enervating whirl of relentless privatization, spiraling inequality, withdrawal of basic state support, and benefits ever increasing and pointless work demands, fake news, unemployment, and precarious work. It is partly to blame, perhaps most wearyingly, are the invasive yet distant commands from media, state institutions, advertisements, friends, or employers to self-maximize, to persevere, to grab a slice of the diminishing pie because you're worth it, although you must constantly prove it every day. In our work and our leisure, we are urged to feign permanent enthusiasm amid radically lowered expectations. Think about the people that push Joe Biden on you for an explanation of radically lowered expectations. Neoliberal newspeak hollows out the terminology of achievement, mandating boasts about personal excellence and dedication as actual possibilities for achievement diminish and work becomes stripped of meaning. At my institution, the cleaners' uniforms are emblazoned with inscriptions announcing that they deliver their work with passion, professionalism, and pride, as if it were reasonable to demand passion from a cleaner on minimum wage whose workload has doubled since 2012. Free choice. A colleague recently informed me that young children in Bermuda make amends for misbehavior by atoning, "I want to make good choices." As criminologists Stephen Hall, Simon Winlow, and Craig Ancrum have explored, choices become life or death when a bad choice or two can turn you into an irremediable loser. We are told that structural barriers to aspiration, achievement, and contentment will melt away in our fantasy choice economy. But this falsehood of free choice demotivates and depoliticizes in such a world. Depression, anxiety, narcissism, the primitive defense of the infantile self against overwhelming attack are entirely logical responses. It has been confirmed that neoliberal societies make their citizens physically as well as mentally sick. The effect is magnified the more unequal the society and more unprotected its citizens from free market competitiveness. Depression in this context may appear almost self-protective and opt out from unwinnable set of continual competitions. The recent rise of diagnoses of mental illness and developmental disorders involving states of agitation and hyperstimulation is similarly interesting. In the case of ADHD, for example, a person's hyperactivity and distractibility render them officially disordered or even disabled, to the extent that they are supposedly unable to cope with the hyperstimulating late capitalist environment. Yet they are, in another sense, entirely in tune with an economy of nonstop distraction in which attention is repeatedly grabbed at and financially exploited. Self-measurement. Neoliberalized healthcare requires every patient, or rather client, of a healthcare services to take responsibility for her own state or behavior. Mental health care is therefore being reframed as a series of outcomes geared at measurable improvement, which the service user must manage themselves as far as possible. Access to psychiatric diagnosis and support from public health services, and also within private or employer-run occupational health care schemes, sometimes depend on completion of a mood or symptom diary using smartphone or Fitbit self-tracking techniques. And there are and there may be more punitive future consequences for failure to self-track as employers and perhaps benefit agencies gain more power to command this sort of performance from its workers. Imagine thinking that going with private insurance is the way to do this instead of nationalizing healthcare, taking the profit motive out of it. But alas, we live in a neoliberal society. This mHealth app revolution shows us how mental illness and anxiety about mental health itself may be deftly commodified and financialized. Measurement apps like Mood Gym are purchased by the UK's National Health Service for use with patients as their patient self-monitors. She is persistently encouraged to demonstrate recovery regardless of long-term impairment. It is telling, too, that recovery is based on fitness for work. See capital's hook there? Fitness for work, since the worthwhile adult is engaged in work activity at all times. This focus on work readiness partially explains the relative paucity of children's mental health services in the UK, which are catastrophically low in beds and were among the first to be privatized. In the US, it's even worse. Care or risk management. Neoliberal states divest themselves of the costs of care by individualizing and privatizing care duties. People displaying troubling symptoms are divided into the dangerous against whom punitive or authoritarian containment methods may be used, and those left to cope with what resources they or their families have left. Isn't that terrible? In the 1970s, saw the closure of the last asylums in the UK and the welcome end of long-term institutionalization for thousands written off as mad and without rights to liberty. As the state also made significant savings through the transfer of patients back into the community, the situation appeared win-win. But half a century after care in the community became the norm for most chronically ill patients, effective community treatment is stymied by slashed budgets, low staffing levels, and morale. Systematically defunded National Health Service, NHS psychiatric services struggle to fulfill the legal burdens placed on them to provide basic care. Increasingly, it is the police who handle frontline mental health crises in the UK. And quite frankly, even though this is UK specific, it's in the US as well. Now, as a father of a child with autism, think I don't worry every single day that a police officer may consider my son non-compliant and shoot him. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Meanwhile, in U.S. prisons, mental health wards house suicidal or otherwise mentally or emotionally unstable prisoners who are placed in special suicide-proof garments and cells, sometimes in prolonged isolation. Any pretense of care will ultimately recede in favor of protection against litigation. In the prison context, suicide smocks are now placed on patients who appear suicidal or psychotic, or on admission or during incarceration in many U.S. states, and are worn even in court. What ways, then, are there to resist worrying trends? Black humor is one way to deal with systems which command positivity, while simultaneously informing you at every stage that you are already a loser. But collectively, of various kinds will be our best protector. As psychologist Paul Verhaeghe predicts, the age of the utterly unrelieved individual has probably reached its limit. What lies beyond the limit, particularly for those who are already broken or caught in the punitive grip of incarcerative care, is less clear. But I would offer up that we have already seen what happens there. And that's your Jeffrey Dahmers, that's your Ted Bundys, that is all the other folks out there who are uncorking guns at elementary schools, who are literally going throughout the country and creating havoc. Why? Because society is falling apart. It's easy to focus on that one guy over there with the gun It's even easier to focus on that guy over there who's a bigot, who's terrified that the immigrants are going to steal his jobs. It's even more easy to understand the families that break apart when they're told that they need more things, and they're always striving, and they're always putting capitalism and their need for work and their need to be seen as great in this society eats them alive and takes them away from their kids and leaves their kids to raise themselves, even with them in the home. Folks, people are not with each other anymore. We have become so disconnected that we're calloused and something's wrong. And people are wondering what it is, but it's clear. It's an ideological proclivity for neoliberalism. And until we solve this problem, we are screwed. Now, I want to tell you, there's another thing that I think really is of vital import. And I think that this is one of these studies, if you will, that is worth talking about. And this was published. Let me get to the top here. Mental health challenges related to neoliberal capitalism in the United States. And this is by Anna Zara. It was published online May 25th, 2021, Community Mental Health, okay, at the NCBIA, National Institute of Health for the Government. And, for those of you willing to look it up, PMCID, PMC 814-5185, PMID 340-32963. I'll just read the abstract. We won't go through the entire thing, but it's worth noting. Rates of mental illness have increased dramatically over the past 15 years in the United States. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention published August 15th, 2017. Additionally, life expectancy has fallen over the past several years due to increases in death from suicide, opioid overdose, and alcoholic liver cirrhosis, as reported by Case and Deaton, Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism, Princeton University Press, 2020. Over the last decade, some have questioned whether these changes are due to neoliberal capitalist policies and ideologies. Neoliberal capitalism incorporates theories of eliminating all restrictions on the market and decreasing government assistance programs, as reported by David Harvey, that is, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, Oxford University Press, 2005. Since these policies have led to income inequality, disempowerment of workers, outsourcing of manufacturing jobs, inadequate social services, mass incarceration, and an expensive and ineffective healthcare system, as reported by Case and Deaton and Nakasha Amakra, International Journal of Health Services, studies have shown that the consequences of these policies and ideologies likely have a role in increasing rates of mental illness. This paper will discuss how these factors increase mental distress and postulate ways that the mental health professionals can advocate for change. Now, I'm going to say this one more time because this is important. There is an absolutely important quote, okay? And it's under the heading of neoliberal ideologies contributing to emotional distress. And it says, neoliberal ideologies, as mentioned above, have also contributed to distress. Neoliberalism encourages individualism, which has decreased emphasis on the need for community and social connection for fulfillment. Since individualism is viewed as a desirable moral characteristic, asking for help, especially financially, is frowned upon. With complete faith in the free market to provide for all who wish to work, people who do not achieve financial success are blamed for their misfortunes. Increasing the stigma of poverty, attitudes towards people who receive government financial assistance can elicit feelings of shame from those who receive benefits. Neoliberalism also encourages consumerism, and when people adopt materialistic values, they are more likely to have symptoms of anxiety and depression, with poorer relationships and lower self-esteem. Neoliberal capitalism has also led to mass incarceration and poverty, particularly in minority populations. Racism and neoliberal ideologies have justified the creation of a disposable population who are viewed as criminals that are unwilling to work. Although it is unclear what is causing increasing suicide rates in Black adolescents, past injustices make it difficult for minorities to escape the financial situations, likely leading to hopelessness and poor mental health, sounding the alarm on Black youth suicide. Margaret Thatcher famously stated that there is no such thing as society, only individual men and women. However, strong social ties and community are beneficial for mental health, and mental disorders are common among people with fewer friends and weaker community engagement. Involvement in community organizations has fallen 45% between 1985 and 1994. Folks, that's the time period when Dahmer was at his peak. Okay. And for many, the immediate family is all that remains as a primary support structure. Well, he didn't have a family, did he? I mean, his family was there, but his dad was gone. His mom was, wow, out there. Marriage rates are also declining among white working class people without a college degree, which has been attributed to poor economic prospects. Researchers John and Stephanie Cacopo have argued that loneliness is a risk factor for symptoms and anxiety and depression. Cacopo, etc., et al. Loneliness has been described as an epidemic due to dramatic increases in perceived loneliness. Since 1980, union participation was once a source of community for workers, but decreases in union participation has caused the community to disappear. Wealth inequality has also been cited as a cause of increased loneliness at levels of distrust in others has been found to be lower in countries with greater wealth inequality compared with countries with lesser wealth inequality. This is likely also due to competitive attitudes towards others, due to ideologies of neoliberal capitalism and competition for social status. Social relationships appear to be better in more egalitarian countries, including better social cohesion and trust, involvement in community life, and lower levels of violence. Okay. So as we look at Dahmer, it's got to be clear to us that he could be any one of us in this neoliberal hell. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a forensic pathologist. I'm none of this stuff. So for me to diagnose Jeffrey Dahmer, or anyone else for that matter, would be a leap. But it doesn't take much to see the impacts that neoliberalism had on all of us, including his family, as they were out chasing a buck and chasing self-fulfillment for individualistic ideas. The mother dealing with postpartum, the father dealing with a career, a son left alone. This is what neoliberalism does to all of us. And when you see the people on television leading the great life, talking about the wonderful things they're doing with individual pursuits, the hyper focus on fitness and the hyper focus on self, this is neoliberalism, and it's destroying society. Folks like Jeff Dahmer didn't have a chance, and the 17 kids he murdered should have been as easy to predict as possible. The only question would have been, how moribund and gruesome would the killings be? We as a society are victims. We're slaves in this world that they've created. If we don't break free from that, if we don't take our lives back, if we don't stop neoliberalism dead in its tracks, if we don't stop making excuses for neoliberals, if we don't stop allowing this system to turn us into monsters, we'll all be monsters, just like Jeffrey Dahmer ended up. This was another episode of Let's Get Ready to Grumble. I'm Steve Grumbine, and I'm out.
And still, Steve